All right, good to see all of you again. We are going to continue our discussion of English colonization in the New World. So last time out, we spent a lot of time on the colony of Virginia. Virginia is very important because it is the first English colony. Its success with tobacco as a cash crop made it very profitable, and of course that proved a great incentive to the British to found more colonies. They had discovered a way to make money in the New World, and the climate, soil, and geography of Virginia helped to dictate its economic growth, its settlement patterns, ultimately its labor systems, its social structure, its in some ways its personality, that spirit of rugged can-do individualism. All of this grows out of the realities that those English colonists encountered when they got to this part of the New World. And we are using Virginia as our model, our paradigm for all the southern colonies. They begin as economic endeavors. They're based on cash crops. That dictates labor systems, first indentured servitude, then slavery. It dictates settlement patterns. And all of those southern colonies, by and large, are Protestant, except for Maryland, which is Catholic. It's the one exception to that rule. But basically, as Virginia goes, the rest of the southern colonies are going to go. The other two colonial regions, we're going to play the same game. We're going to select a colony and put our focus on that as the sort of model for the other colonies in that region. And where we're going to turn next are the New England colonies, which ironically are, in some sense, the most famous of all the English colonies. When we think of English colonization in the New World, it's often to the New England colonies we go for a lot of reasons. Holidays, it's where the American Revolution is really going to start, these sorts of things. And to understand where the New England colonies come from, we have to leave America. We've got to travel back to England, because the New England colonies are going to be about as different from the southern colonies as you can possibly imagine. So back in England, after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, solidified Elizabeth I on the throne and secured the English Reformation, which remember creates under Elizabeth I the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, and this faith was a combination of Catholic and Protestant. So it taught Protestant doctrine, but it kept Catholic forms. So you had the saints, and you had the same kind of cathedrals, and the same holidays, and these sorts of things. So this really was a merger of the two religions, which of course was exactly what Elizabeth I intended. Remember that she had said that this was all about Jesus Christ, and basically implied, if not outright stated, that the forms and the practices of the faith are not what mattered as much as what the faith taught, what the faith believed. In this way, Catholic and Protestant are much closer together than they are apart. So that combined faith, this Anglican church, in England, satisfied most people, but of course it didn't satisfy everybody. There were Catholics who would refuse to give up their Catholic faith. Some of them would migrate to America and create the colony of Maryland, but the Catholics were not nearly as much of a problem for England as radical Protestants, radical Calvinists who despised everything about the Catholic Church. And despising everything about the Catholic Church, many of them believed that a church that combined Catholicism with the Protestant faith was a corrupted church. And the most fanatical of those who despised this combined religion were known as the Separatists. Now, they are a fringe group. As best we can tell, there were maybe 5,000 separatists in all of England. So it's a teeny tiny minority of the citizenry, but they were ardent in their beliefs. Anything Catholic was wrong, and therefore the Catholic residue, if you will, in the Church of England meant that the Church of England was a corrupted church. It was not the kind of church that they believed God intended them to worship in. And they felt that the English church was therefore irredeemable, and they wished to separate from it. So this group of religious dissenters in England get their name. They are known as separatists. Separatists hate the Catholicism of the Church of England, and therefore they wish to separate from that church entirely. They want to have their own church, a pure Protestant church, if you will, in which there is no Catholicism whatsoever. And this, of course, is a problem because this is a day and age where the idea of a separation of church and state is considered to be preposterous. The church and state were in many ways one and the same thing. The King or Queen of England is the head of the English church. To be a good Englishman, you must be a good Anglican. You have to have faith in the English church. They have loyalty to the English government. And that was the way it was seen by the leaders of the church. It was the way it was seen by the leaders of the government. The way it's seen by much of the society. And so the separatists were not only being religious heretics in the eyes of the government and the Church of England, they were also being political traitors. They were being disloyal, and this got them into a lot of trouble. They were harassed, they were arrested, they had their property taken, some of them were tortured and executed, and their religion was driven underground. They could not practice it openly as they wished. And of course, this was a bad thing for them. They didn't like it. It made everything very hard, but it didn't manage to snuff out their faith. Being religious zealots, the more they were persecuted, the more zealous they became. They considered this to be a test by God to see if they would hold true to their faith. But it did make practicing their faith exceptionally hard. And eventually the separatists decided that not only did they need to separate from the Church of England, they needed to separate from England itself. And so they asked for permission from the king to migrate to Holland. They wanted to go a few hundred miles across the North Sea and settle in with the Dutch. And remember, Holland is where the Calvinist faith was first born. The Dutch are totally Protestant. There's no Catholicism there to speak of whatsoever. So the English separatists want to move in with their co-religionist, the Dutch. And the king is very happy to let them do that, more than happy to see them leave England. And so the separatists move to Holland, where they are welcomed. They settle, they buy land, they start businesses, and they do very, very well. This is working out for them in a practical day-to-day sense. And for many of the separatists, that's fine, that's good. But for some of them, there is still a problem, and that problem is they realize that they are slowly being assimilated into Dutch culture, Dutch society. Their children are growing up speaking English and Dutch. They're growing up, wearing Dutch clothes and playing Dutch games and these sorts of things. And they realize that in a generation or so, they will not be English at all. They will, in fact, be Dutch. And although they have a problem with the Church of England, and they have a problem with the way that the English government has treated them, they're still proud Englishmen. They don't want to lose that English identity, and if they stay in Holland, that's going to happen. So some of them decide that they not only have to separate from the Church of England and England itself, they need to separate from Holland as well. And so they go back to the English king and they've asked for permission to migrate to America. They want to go to Virginia. And of course, here they could remain English, but a couple of thousand miles away from the Church of England and the English government, they would probably be able to practice their faith as they saw fit. And you might wonder why the king would agree to that. Virginia is just beginning to find its way to tobacco and is starting to be profitable. Why would you want to pollute this new colony in America with these nasty separatist types? But on reflection, remember that about half of every boatload of colonists who are arriving in Virginia during this period are dying of disease. So in some sense, the separatists are all but signing their death warrant. If you're happy to get them a few hundred miles away in Holland, why not get them a few thousand miles away in America where they will be able to cause no trouble? And so the king gives these separatists permission. The first of the separatists scrape together some money. They don't have a lot of it, and they set sail for Virginia in the fall of 1620. 102 men, women, and children. One of the things about the Protestant faith is it's a congregationalist faith, as is going to be practiced in America, which means any group of people can get together and form a congregation. They can hire a minister and conduct their own church affairs and these sorts of things. This is the organizational style, if you will, of the separatists. And so they're going to go to America as entire congregations. The ship they rented was a broken down old vessel known as the Mayflower, and they had very bad luck on the voyage to the New World. They got caught in several storms. Instead of that voyage taking a little more than 2 months, it took them nearly 4. They were blown badly off course. The ship almost sank on a couple of occasions. And when they arrived finally in the Western Hemisphere, they weren't anywhere near Virginia. They had been blown so far off course that they were hundreds and hundreds of miles north off the coast of what is today modern Massachusetts. And instead of fellow Englishmen at Jamestown willing to welcome them and help them get started, they looked off of the Mayflower onto a snow-covered, rocky, inhospitable shore where there was no greeting party whatsoever. That looked like a daunting prospect, but the last thing they wanted to do was to try and sail south to Virginia and endure more of a long sea voyage. And remember, being good religious zealots, they believed that if they had endured these travails on the Atlantic Ocean and God had brought them to the Massachusetts coast, because that's where he wanted them. It was around this time, of course, that the separatists began to take on a different name. They called themselves Pilgrims. A pilgrim is someone who takes a long and often arduous voyage as part of a pilgrimage, a religious pilgrimage. So if you're on a religious journey, you are a pilgrim. And of course, the separatists have very much been on a religious journey. So Pilgrims is the name by which they are better known in American history. And although the Pilgrims did not have permission to settle in what will become New England, the king had told them they could settle in Virginia, in the Chesapeake. This was nonetheless land claimed by England, although never actually occupied by England. So they wrote out something called the Mayflower Compact, which was in a way their constitution. This is the way they were going to govern themselves. And they went ashore and they founded the colony of Plymouth. So the second successful English colony in the New World will be known as Plymouth. And it's always going to be a very small colony. It's going to be very poor. In that first winter, half of the 102 settlers died. And it's going to take quite a while for Plymouth to kind of expand and to become more stable. And one of the reasons for that is not just that very hard first winter, they get ashore after this long sea voyage, figuring out how to stay alive, and that would be difficult even if they had been trying to do it in the South. A big problem with Plymouth in the way that the Pilgrims ran it is that initially it was organized around communism. That was, being all a congregation, we're all in this together. Everybody is going to contribute to society and to the economy as best they can, and then we will equally distribute what we collectively produce. And that kind of a system always sounds great in the abstract. Everybody works hard and does their best and contributes to society, and then we take the accumulated bounty and we share it equally. But when you deal in the real world with real human beings, it doesn't work that way at all, because there are people who are lazy, who are shiftless, and who do not wish to work, who will claim that they are hurt or that they're ill or they just won't work very hard. And why should they? Because they're going to get an equal share. They're going to get equal share. So this idea that by equally distributing the produce of your society. You're going to help the truly sick, the truly infirm, the widows, the orphans, and that kind of thing. That idea becomes corrupted by people who wish to game the system, who wish to take advantage of it. And of course, this is going to be noticed by other people. And they're going to say, hey, I get no more food than anybody else, although I'm working very hard. And this guy over here, who I know isn't really sick, he's just lazy, he's shiftless, he's getting as much food as I am, and he's basically doing nothing. So why should I, continue to work hard? I think I will slack off, or I'll say, hey, I'm sick, I'm hurt, I can't work as well. And before you know it, the number of producers shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and that means that there's less and less to distribute, and sooner or later, basically everybody is suffering. Everybody is on the verge of starvation. Now, this is just basic human nature. You can wish that it wasn't that way, but that's the way. Think about it here in this class. If I was going to, pool the grades and take the grade that everybody made, add it together, divide it by 36, which is the number of students that we have in this class, and everybody gets the average of that score. Well, you have some students who are going to work very hard and do very well, who are going to make A's and B's, and some students who are going to struggle initially and are going to make C's, and some students who may not try at all, and are going to make D's and F's. But the students who didn't work very hard, who waited to the last minute, who made the D's and F's, are going to probably wind up with B's because so many people worked hard and got A's and B's or high C's, and that lifts the scores. But if you worked hard enough to get, say, a 95 on the test, but some students didn't do the work and they got a 55 on the test, and when we average the grades, everybody gets an 80. So for the student who didn't do anything, who didn't work hard, who didn't do well, got that 55, that works out wonderfully for you, right? You didn't put in the effort, you didn't do the work, you didn't try, you didn't care. Your 55 becomes an 80, but for the student who really worked hard, who did their very best and was really successful, their 95 is reduced to a B. Well, at that point, a lot of the students who worked hard, they get those A's and B's are going to decide, hey, that's not worth it. I'm not going to work as hard. And so on the next test, maybe they only score in the low 80s, or they get C's instead, whereas the student who wasn't trying very hard in the beginning has been rewarded for not trying hard, so maybe they don't try at all. So instead of 55, they get a 45, but there are no longer any 95s or 85s to balance. And so now when I average the score, the average test grade is not an 80, it's a 70. And at that point, the person who didn't do the work, didn't put any effort into it, got the 45, still doing pretty well, right? I'm doing nothing, it's still a passing grade. But the people who scored in the upper 70s and the low 80s are like, man, this is not working out for me. So they do even less hard work on the third test. And of course, the person who's been benefiting by doing very little and getting higher scores does even less. And so now on that final test, when we average the grades, there aren't any A's, there aren't any B's. At best, there's some mid-level C's, and the final average for everybody is a 55, so everybody fails. That's how communist systems, socialist systems work in the real world. You have to take into account human nature, and this is something that the Pilgrims failed to do. Not everybody is going to go out and work hard if they're not going to receive a reward for working hard, if they're not going to receive a benefit for their additional efforts, for their talents and their skills. And so after a couple of years of trying this communist system and having it fail dismally, the Pilgrim Fathers said, okay, no, that's it. We're reverting to capitalism. Everybody is going to get to keep what they make. They're going to get to keep what they earn, and then we're going to prevail upon them through their generosity, donate to the sick and the infirm and the widows and the orphans. And what happened is pretty predictable. Now that everybody knew that there would be a direct reward for what they did, now that people knew that if they didn't put in their best effort, they would suffer, except for the generosity of the people who did put in in the best effort, then everybody redoubled the amount of work that they did, and there was a bounty. There was an enormous harvest. There's plenty of fish, and the fear of starvation disappeared. And at that juncture, the Pilgrims decided to hold a feast of Thanksgiving. They invited the Indians, who they had worked very hard to befriend, and the Indians had taught them things like how to grow corn and how to survive in the North American wilderness. And this day of Thanksgiving, of course, becomes the foundation for our modern national holiday. By the way, the first Thanksgiving feast was nothing like the one that shows up in the Norman Rockwell paintings that the most people would think of as a traditional Thanksgiving meal. There wasn't a lot of turkey, certainly no cranberry sauce or anything like that. There was a lot of seafood. They were living on the coast. These were Englishmen. They were fishers, and so more seafood than turkey. And nonetheless, it was a tradition that took off in the New England states. And most of us are familiar with the Pilgrims as a result of this Thanksgiving story. This is how myth in history is born. So, if you think about the history of English colonization in the New World, the thing that probably comes to your mind is the Pilgrims. Nobody remembers those poor settlers down at Jamestown and John Rolfe with tobacco and all that kind of thing. Everybody thinks of the Pilgrims, and we're introduced to the Pilgrims through, holiday specials, after-school specials, those sorts of things. When you were at elementary school, maybe you took the rounded scissors and the white paste and the construction paper, and you made turkeys and pilgrim hats and pilgrim bonnets and these sorts of things. And the Pilgrims get celebrated for that first Thanksgiving, and they are celebrated also for fleeing oppression, for coming to the New World in search of religious freedom. And of course, Americans like the idea of religious freedom, and so that makes the Pilgrims a group of people that should be lauded, that should be remembered, that should be celebrated. But it's not quite the truth of the story, because the Pilgrims, although they did flee religious oppression in England, they did come to the New World seeking religious freedom, did not believe in the concept of religious freedom. They believed that their faith, their separatist faith, was the one true faith. Everybody else in the entire world was wrong. And so they were not willing to extend religious freedom to other people. Plymouth was, in fact, something of a religious despotism. There was only one faith there, the separatist faith, because that was the only right faith, and you could not believe anything else in the colony of Plymouth. So religious freedom for me, but not for thee, so to speak. And so the story is more complex, as it always is, than is typically portrayed in myth and popular culture. Plymouth is always going to be very small. It's going to be very poor. It's going to take those first settlers 20 years to pay off the debt that they ran up just getting to America. Eventually, Plymouth is going to be absorbed by the colony of Massachusetts, but that tradition of Thanksgiving is going to live on. It's going to become a New England holiday. It's going to become a national holiday in the midst of the American Civil War. In November of 1863, President Lincoln declared a national day of Thanksgiving to celebrate Union victories in the Civil War at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. And he said, there was already the regional holiday in New England, so it became a national holiday, and thus the origins of a national Thanksgiving come from the midst of our Civil War, and the actual origins of Thanksgiving a little bit different than most of us were taught in elementary school. The colony that's going to absorb Plymouth is going to be founded like Plymouth for religious reasons, but slightly different religious reasons. So after the Pilgrims leave England, after the separatists separate from England, the public enemy number one on the religious front for the British becomes another group of fanatical Protestants who agree with the separatists that Catholicism is the root of all evil. Everything Catholic is wrong, and therefore the Church of England is corrupt because it's got all this Catholic residue in it. It's this mixture of Protestant and Catholic. And these people, like the separatists, believe that means that they cannot worship in the Church of England, that they cannot practice in the Church of England because that church is wicked, that church is wrong, that church is corrupt. It's not the kind of church that God wishes to be worshipped in. But here we get a difference because this group, unlike the separatist, does not believe that the Church of England is irredeemable. They believe that the Church of England can be cleaned up. The Church of England can be saved from itself. The Church of England can be purified. And so this group of radical Protestants becomes known as the Puritans because they want to purify the Church of England, simply not turn their back on it, separate it. They want to save it. They want to clean it up. They want to bring it onto the right side of the line, if you will. And this is not quite as radical a philosophy as separation, and therefore there are 10 times as many Puritans as there are separatists, maybe 50,000 Puritans all told. And the Puritans, of course, are an even bigger problem for the British powers that be than the separatists, not just because there are a lot more of them, but because their philosophy is more obnoxious to the British authorities. Think of it this way. Suppose that you had, that we were meeting in person, and that you had a classmate who for some reason took an instant disliking to you. Maybe it's the way you wear your hair, maybe it's the music you listen to, maybe it's the sports team that you support on your t-shirt or something like that. But this person, for some reason, just absolutely loathes and hates you. And any time that you come into a room, they get up and leave. They don't even want to share the same space with you. They don't want to breathe the same air as you. And so they get up and they disappear. Well, that would be embarrassing, wouldn't it? And a little awkward. We all prefer to be liked, or at least tolerated by our fellow man. But, eventually we get used to that, right? I mean, they're the one who's leaving. You're not the one who's having to go away. So what difference does it make to you? If they hate you so much that they edit themselves from your life, you will not even notice. But suppose you have another classmate who feels exactly the same way about you. Who doesn't like your political affiliations, your religious affiliations, your sports affiliation, doesn't like the way you dress, the way you drive, where you live, the TV shows you watch, the internet sites you go to. But that person, instead of saying, I want nothing to do with you, you show up, I'm gone, that person says, I'm going to save you. I'm going to make you my project. So instead of leaving, they come and sit next to you. They follow you around. They're sending you emails all the time. They're saying, hey, why don't you dress differently? Why don't you listen to my music? Why don't you come check out my church? Why don't you come to a political rally with me or something like that? They're constantly whispering in your ear and trying to convert you and trying to change you and trying to alter you. Which of those two people would irritate you more? The person who gets up and disappears when you show up, or the person who's constantly badgering you to change your ways? I think most of us find that second person a great deal more irritating, and so you can sort of see separatists and Puritans in that way, right? The separatists are the people who are just getting up and leaving whenever the Church of England comes into the room, but the Puritans are the one who are sitting behind the Church of England, whispering in his ear, saying, hey, we need to get rid of all that Catholic stuff, right? Let's cut that out. And of course, the English government, the English church, did not like this any more than they liked the separatists. And so the Puritans came in for the same grief. They were hounded, they were harassed, they were jailed, their life was made miserable, they were driven underground. And for the Puritans, this was worse than just the day-to-day difficulties that were being imposed upon them. It was worse because it was undercutting their mission. If you're trying to save England from itself, if you're trying to save the Church of England from itself, you're trying to purify it, how do you do that? Well, you got to be able to engage people, right? You got to be able to prophesize. You got to be able to get your story out there. You got to be able to argue your point. And if you're driven underground, you are not going to be able to do that. And Specifically, the Puritan fathers had this vision of building a city on a hill, a literal city on a hill that would be centered on a Puritan church, and it would be the perfect society that would work in perfect harmony. And if they could build that city on a hill and let the people of England see its perfection, they were certain that the English people would realize that, hey, we've been going down the wrong path, that we need to change our way, we need to follow the Puritans. Well, if you're having to practice your faith in a cellar, you're not going to build a city on a hill. You're not going to be able to accomplish your mission. At that point, the Puritan leadership decided that they were going to have to find some place, a physical place, where they could build that city on a hill. Led by a man named John Winthrop, they figured it out that there was only one place they could go to build that city on a hill, and that was America. You had to do it in English territory. You had to do it someplace where you could practice your faith, though, freely. And you weren't going to do it in England. It would do you no good to go to Holland. You had to prove that this would work within an English context. So if you're going to do this on English soil and you can't do it in England, that means you've got to do it in America. And so the Puritans went to the king in March of 1627. And they asked for permission to migrate to the New World to found a colony next door to Plymouth for the purposes of starting plantations. And so the cover story for the Puritans is, hey, look, we want to go to the New World. We want to make money. We want to start plantations. Well, plantation in a modern mindset, has this gone with the wind aura to it, the big columned mansion, and it's all based on cotton. In reality, a plantation in early American history is a place where you are planting crops and growing them to make money, usually with cash crops, to be sure, like tobacco, but you could go anywhere and start an agricultural enterprise, and technically it would be a plantation. Of course, you weren't going to grow tobacco up in New England. The growing season is too short for that. Climate, soil, and geography are basically all wrong for it. But nonetheless, Virginia's starting to make money with plantations, and so why not? Why not the Puritans? And of course, the king is not really fooled by this. He knows that what the Puritans are really trying to do is go over there and set up their own little religious experiment, but he's okay with that. He was happy to get the separatist a couple thousand miles across the Atlantic Ocean. He's going to be happy to get a lot of the Puritans that far away from England. So he grants them a charter for something called the Massachusetts Bay Company. And this speaks to something that the British like to do. They preferred what was called indirect rule. So England would claim territory overseas, but rather than the English government go to the expense of founding colonies and governing colonies of these kinds of, the British government would grant a company like the Virginia Company, now the Massachusetts Bay Company, or sometimes a single individual like Sir Walter Raleigh, permission to found a colony in territory that England claimed. And so that company or that individual would bear all the expense, would do all the work, but would expand the British Empire, plant the flag, and improve Britain's economic capabilities, and as well as enhance its empire, which would accrue to its military benefit as well. So the Massachusetts Bay Company is now going to do in New England what the Virginia Company had been trying to do in the Chesapeake. The Puritans take their time. They're not going to leave England until March of 1630, and instead of a single ship carrying 100 or so settlers, as had founded Jamestown or as had founded Plymouth, they are going to go in a fleet of ships, 11 vessels carrying 2,000 people. Again, entire congregations, men, women, children. They're taking pigs and cows and other animals with them, and they come to America. They move in next door to the Pilgrims, and despite coming in these large numbers, that first winter was still very hard. You've got, after a long sea voyage, you're weakened. You got to get acclimated. The New World is not an easy place to settle. That first winter of 1630, 200 of these initial 2,000 Puritan settlers died, and the next spring another 100 said, no, this isn't for me, and they went back to England. But the remaining 1,700 hung on, and they established the colony of Massachusetts. And throughout the early 1640s, another 16,000 Puritans are going to follow them. The Puritans, of course, are coming over for religious purposes, just like the Separatists, aka the Pilgrims, had come over for religious purposes. They came over as congregations, and the climate, soil, and geography that they found in New England was very different than the South. There weren't a lot of navigable rivers that cut inland to the coast. There was a jagged coastline. It was kind of rough and rocky, but there were lots of natural harbors in it where you could establish towns that would be depots for trade, so goods collected from the interior would be gathered there to be shipped to Europe. Goods coming from Europe would come there to be offloaded so that they could be distributed into the interior. Those towns would eventually become cities, such as Boston, which would become the capital and the biggest city in the New England colonies. Since the soil wasn't right, the growing season was too short for cash crops, you raised mainly foodstuffs and you raised livestock, and that requires a lot less land. And having come over as Congregationalists, the Puritans were inclined to a different settlement pattern anywhere. And so the congregation would go out, they would pick a spot, they would build a church, they would build their homes around the church and a few businesses, and then their farms, of course, would be with the homes. And since you need a lot less land to make a profitable farm when you're growing food or raising livestock than you do tobacco, these New England towns, townships as they came to be called, were kind of compacted. Townships become more of the backbone of the New England colonies than counties. Although the New England colonies will have counties, the township or the town will be the real building block of society. Since people are living close together, there's more of a spirit of cooperation, more of a spirit of community. People are tending to work together, and of course, it's not just growing food and livestock. New England is much hillier, much rockier than the southern colonies, so you have these enormous forests with these giant trees, and so lumbering becomes an industry. And since you have these natural harbors where towns are growing up, you're going to get seafaring and all the kind of labor that's involved in that. And from the very beginning, these New England colonies are going to be much more densely populated than the southern colonies, because people are not going to spread out. They're going to come over in greater numbers and great big chunks all at once, too. And whenever you have large congregations of people, you're going to get diversification of economic activity. So in towns that grow into cities, you're going to have carpenters and blacksmiths and coopers and silversmiths and doctors and lawyers and booksellers and these sorts of things. So you get a much denser settlement pattern, and you get a much more diverse kind of economy in New England than you're going to get in the South. And of course, the other thing that we need to recognize about the Puritans is that they no more believed in the concept of religious tolerance than the Separatists did. And in fact, the government of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony as it was called, but eventually just becomes Massachusetts, is very much the same as the government of the Puritan Church. And the two overlap in a very serious way. And the Puritans, like the Separatists, believe that there's one true faith. It's the Calvinist faith, and it's the only one that's going to be allowed in their colony. They even kind of look askew at the Separatists as crazy cousins that they happen to have moved in next door to, but who they do not really approve of in a meaningful way. We know the Pilgrims, courtesy of the Thanksgiving holiday. We know the Puritans too, but they have a much less laudable look in our culture. So if we remember the Pilgrims every Thanksgiving and we have a big holiday, we remember the Puritans through things like the book The Scarlet Letter and the Salem witch trials and the play The Crucible. The Puritans are probably not people that you would have enjoyed hanging around with. They were very serious. They believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible, and they believed that the end times were around the corner, that Christ was about to come back at any day and judge the living and the dead and send the good people to heaven and the bad people to hell. What God had to say to mankind, He'd said a long time ago in the Bible, and it was written down, and it was to be taken literally. They didn't believe in playing sports. They didn't believe in playing cards. They didn't believe in having theater. All these things were distractions from the faith. Puritans believed, as most Calvinists did, that you had to work hard, that you had to live a good life in order to help to prove that you were one of the elect, predestined for heaven. So you probably wouldn't have enjoyed spending any time with the Puritans. The Puritans, however, were very hardworking people. They built an impressive society very quickly. Puritan families were very big, and so it was not uncommon for a couple to have 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 kids. So we know that the Puritans were doing some things that modern people at least enjoy doing. They were making lots of babies, and therefore the family was the primary labor force. There were some indentured servants. Slavery would eventually find its way to New England, but the family was the primary labor force. And children were to work at a very early age because there was always work to do and they needed to start contributing as quickly as they could. But mortality was also high, not as bad as it was in the southern colonies, but it wasn't uncommon that if you had, say, 7 children, to see only 2 or 3 of them live to be adults and others die as infants or as children or as adolescents. But you did have a more healthy climate in New England than you did in the South, and primarily courtesy of fewer swamps with disease-carrying mosquitoes in them, for as a primary reason. Everything was not milk and honey in the Massachusetts colony, which eventually absorbed Plymouth, and so Plymouth is gone long before the American Revolution. A colony founded for religious reasons is going to be very sensitive to religious questions, and so there were religious troublemakers who found their way into Massachusetts, and a couple of examples of these. One is Roger Williams. Roger Williams came to New England in 1631, and he was really an extreme separatist, but he moved to a Puritan colony. But he was a charismatic fellow and a great preacher, great speaker, so he found a congregation that wanted to hire him. And remember, this is the way congregational relation works. We could all get together and decide to be a congregation. As a congregation, we could build our church, we could run our own church affairs, we could hire our minister, pay his salary, and that kind of thing. So Roger Williams found some very dedicated followers who liked what he was preaching. The problem was that what he was preaching ran counter to the beliefs of the Puritan Church in some instances and ran counter to the interest of the Massachusetts government and others. So Williams is preaching separatism, not Puritanism, so there's one strike against him. He's also doing things like saying that the settlers have no right to take the lands of the Indians, that they had taken those illegally. And of course, this ran counter to the beliefs of English colonists in the South as well as in New England. Hey, we came to this land, we looked around, it was pretty much vacant. There was nobody living here. Certainly the Indians have not followed the dictates of the Bible to improve upon the land and make it their own. And improving upon the land, of course, meant fences, it meant roads, it meant towns, it meant buildings and farms, and you couldn't find a lot of that there. The Indians hadn't even invented the wheel, and so this was a primitive society, and it was hunter-gatherer. It sort of moved over territory for the most part instead of actually possessing it, and in many instances we traded with the Indians for land. If they were willing to sell us, a lot lot of territory for a trunk full of tools and cloth and these sorts of things, then, well, that's on them and not us. They made a bad bargain, we made a good one, or we've fought them. We've defeated them militarily and conquered the land, which, of course, in this era in history was a perfectly legitimate, legal, and acceptable way to obtain territory. And so Roger Williams is gotten his way crosswise with the Puritan Church and the government of Massachusetts. And so he's told to cool it, to shut up, to change his way. He refuses. His followers continue to back him. And so ultimately they are exiled to the southeast. And ultimately they're given their own colony, which will become Rhode Island, which will receive its own royal charter in 1633. And if you've ever wondered why we have this one state, this teeny tiny little state, Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island is smaller than the county, Harris County in Texas, where Houston is. The whole state's smaller than Harris County, Texas. It's because this is where Massachusetts is going to send all of its troublemakers. And included amongst those troublemakers is a woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson lived in early Boston, and one of the things that the Puritan Church did allow that was unique for its faith was allowed women to do things like to teach Sunday school. And Anne Hutchinson had a very dedicated following, and she got herself into trouble by claiming that she was receiving divine inspiration. That is, God was talking directly to her, having a one-on-one conversation with her, sharing things of great religious import to her. And she was preaching that. She was sharing that with her Sunday school. She got a following because of that. And the difficulty here, of course, is that the Puritan Church doesn't believe in divine revelation. God's done with humanity. He said what he has to say. He said it a long time ago. It's written down in the Bible. You will interpret that literally. Divine revelation is a recipe for religious anarchy, because if anybody can run around and say, hey, I know that the church is saying this and the Bible is being interpreted this way, but God and I were having coffee last night and he said, no, that's not right. It's this. Well, if people can say that, then the entire structure of your faith and everything built around it and on it is going to collapse. And so Anne Hutchinson was told, no, you're not receiving divine revelation. You need to quit saying that. She refused, so he was put on trial for heresy. She was, of course, easily convicted because she stuck to her story. And so she, along with her followers, were banished to Rhode Island alongside Roger Williams. They got sent there in 1637. So Rhode Island is tiny because it's where Massachusetts sends its ne'er-do-wells, its troublemakers, its people who won't play by its rules. And so Rhode Island, like Massachusetts and Plymouth, is founded for religious purposes. Now, the other New England colonies, New Hampshire and Connecticut, they're going to show up later in 1677 for New Hampshire and 1662 for Connecticut. And basically, they are overflow from Massachusetts. The Massachusetts begins to get too crowded, too big. People move further and further inland to find farmlands. And so these colonies are not founded per se for religious purposes, but they are, standing on the shoulders of colonies that were founded for religious purposes. And of course, the people who moved there carry those separatist and those Puritan religious roots with them. And so you get the New England colonies, and these colonies are rather different than the southern colonies, right? They're founded primarily for religious purposes. They are founded by congregations rather than collections of individuals. The climate, soil, and geography is very different, so you get a different settlement pattern, you get a different labor system, and therefore you get a different a kind of an economy that is much more diverse than you're going to find in the South. But like in the South, these are also Protestant colonies. They are Protestant colonies, but where religion is much more important than just about anything else. And so that gets us to the New England colonies, and that leaves us us with the last of the colonial regions to talk about, and those are the middle colonies. The middle colonies. The aptly named colonies because they are in between the southern colonies and the New England colonies. And your middle colonies are New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And as might be expected from being in the middle, they're sort of a mix of the South and New England. So you have better land for large-scale agriculture in places like Pennsylvania, which is going to kind of become the breadbasket of America. Going to grow a superabundance of corn and wheat and raise livestock and that kind of stuff. And then you have the colonies of New York and New Jersey that are more New England than they are Southern. And the reasons for settlement are different too. New York and New Jersey are what are called proprietary colonies. And so it sort of harkens back to the Sir Walter Raleigh experiment. So the king gives certain people that he likes the right to go and found colonies. And so one of them is the Duke of York, and the other is the Dukes of Jersey. There are two of them, brothers, and they are given colonies in the New World. And the way that they're going to make money in these colonies is they're going to charge people for the privilege of living there, what are called quint rents, quick rents. So they're going to be absentee landlords. They're themselves not going to come over and live, but they're going to, let people settle on their land and get rich from it. The colony of New York is going to be built on the one Dutch colony that exists in the New World, and it's going to be along the Hudson River in what is today New York City, basically. The Dutch had a very small colony there they called New Amsterdam or New Netherlands. The British are going to take that in 1664. While they're at war with the Dutch, there won't be any fight. The Dutch will just surrender. And after that, the Duke of York got a charter to make an English colony on the basis of this former Dutch colony. Basically, the Dukes of York, the Dukes of Jersey are going to come in. They're going to found these colonies for religious purposes. And again, remember, we're painting very broad brushstrokes here. We're grossly oversimplifying all this just to get ourselves down the road to the American Revolution or the seeds of the American Revolution. We're going to slow down. And the history of each of these colonies we talk about is incredibly complex, incredibly fascinating. We could give an entire semester to each and every one of them. We don't have time to do that. So if Massachusetts is our model for New England and Virginia is our model for the South, what's going to be our model for the middle colonies? Well, it's not going to be New York and New Jersey because although they're going to be very important in American history, they're not going to be the dominant colony in New England. They're founded for economic purposes. Those economic purposes for their founders don't really work out. It's very hard to collect rent when you're a couple thousand miles on the other side of an ocean. And eventually the Duke of York will kind of, give up. The two Dukes of Jersey, brothers, couldn't get along with each other. There was an East Jersey, West Jersey. Eventually they're going to give up, and it's going to become a single colony of New Jersey, and they're both going to become royal colonies. That is, the British government is going to wind up controlling them, owning them because their proprietors have left. That is not the case with Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is founded, ironically, for religious purposes. And here, the group that carries that out is known as the Quakers. So after the Separatists and the Puritans sort of, ceased being serious religious problems in England, you had another group that earned the ire of the authorities, and those were the Quakers. And the Quakers didn't really care about what was going on in the Church of England. They weren't, hardliners against Catholicism or Calvinism or anything like that. They were Protestant, but they did not believe in a highly organized religion. They were the Society of Friends. They believed in religious tolerance. Everybody should practice their faith, worship God as they saw fit. The Quakers lived a very simple and austere life. They had meeting houses instead of churches and cathedrals. They considered even a steeple on a church to be ostentatious and pretentious. They didn't have an organized clergy, so to speak, and the leader of the Quakers was a fellow named William Penn. So if we know what the Puritans of the Pilgrims look like, courtesy of Thanksgiving, and they sort of dress the same way, behave the same way, we know what Quakers look like because if you've seen a box of Quaker oats, you have seen a Quaker, that's actually William Penn, who's on the box of Quaker oats. And William Penn was the son of a prominent British admiral. He was a very bad businessman. He always in debt, always getting hauled into the courts because of his debt. He was not wise with money at all, but he was zealous about his faith, and he was constantly promoting it, which of course is not acceptable in England. And so he's getting in the newspapers and he's getting in trouble for that as well as for his debts. And this is all very embarrassing to his father, the admiral, who's a good friend with the king. And the king, to help the admiral out, eventually says, you know what we should do? We should get young William out of the country. We should send him someplace where he can take his crazy cult religion with him and hopefully make something of himself. And so Penn is given a colony to the west of New York and New Jersey called Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is Old European for Penn's Woods. So wherever you see Sylvania, that means woods. Penn's Woods. And the Quakers are the people who are going to settle Pennsylvania by and large, but they're going to welcome anybody. They're going to build a city that they're going to name Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, which will become the largest, most cosmopolitan city in America. It's going to be eventually where the Continental Congress is going to set up camp during the American Revolution. Pennsylvania is going to become a very, very profitable colony, and it is the Quakers who finally bring the concept of religious tolerance to the New World. The Quakers bring that idea to the New World. Anybody is welcome in Pennsylvania. Catholic, separatist, Calvinist, Puritan, Anglican, Quaker, it doesn't matter. Everybody is welcome there and can worship as they see fit. And that points to the idea that the more open a society can be, and the freer the people in that society can be, the more prosperous they are going to be, the more productive they're going to be, the happier that they are going to be. The success of Pennsylvania doesn't really help William Penn out very much. His debts in England are still dogging him. To make some money, he's going to sell off the 4 southern southeastmost colonies of Pennsylvania, and they're going to become the colony of Delaware. So if you wonder why we have this other tiny little state, the state of Delaware, it's because in essence it was created in a garage sale that William Penn had to make money. Penn was constantly going back to England to defend himself in debtor's court, and on one of these visits he got sick and he died, so he leaves the story. But the colony of Pennsylvania that he leaves behind is one that is going to be the primary colony of the middle colonies. It's going to have agriculture that's more akin to the South in terms of its scale and its growing season, but it's not be growing tobacco, it's going to be growing foodstuffs. Settlement patterns, though, are a little bit more like you're going to find in New England. It's certainly the same with New York and New Jersey. And it is here where you're going to have really the seeds planted of some very fundamental American ideas. The colony of Pennsylvania guaranteed its settlers liberty of conscience, to believe what they wanted, to practice faith as they wanted. They promised them freedom from persecution, no taxation without representation, due process of law. You had to be charged with a crime and you had to be tried before a jury of your peers, these sorts of things. The government of Pennsylvania was not a religious government. It was a 3-branch government. So if this sounds familiar to you, there would be a governor and you would have a council and assembly, a sort of 2-branch legislature. By 1685, there were 8,000 people living in Pennsylvania, which was a very diverse colony. And it would go on to play a key role in the American Revolution. So Pennsylvania matters a great deal, even though Penn dies in 1718. So there, in a very broad way, very quick, simplified way, we get ultimately to the 13 colonies, the 3 colonial regions, the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies, with Massachusetts being our model for New England, Pennsylvania being our model for the middle, and Virginia being our model for the southern colonies. And one of the things that you probably noticed is that these colonies seem very different from each other. The colonial regions certainly seem different from each other, but even the individual colonies themselves. On the map, they all butt right up against each other, but remember, there's very little to no infrastructure in America. Coastal shipping is the easiest, fastest way to move goods, people, to communicate amongst these colonies. They're built in a vast wilderness, and even though they will evolve over time, each of them is their own separate place, founded at different times by different groups of people for different purposes, and as a result, they tend to see each other as rivals. They see each other as competitors, and they don't have a lot of contact with each other. And so these colonies are more different, it seems, on the surface at least, than they are alike, and yet ultimately they're going to come together to make a common country. And when we get together for our next lecture, we're going to look at how that begins to happen. So this is where we end our story of the founding of the 13 colonies. That takes us through the end of chapter 3 in your book. Our next lecture, we will begin with chapter 4. So now 3 questions to finish out lecture 2. So this is lecture 2, part 2. You had 2 questions in part 1. Now you're going to get 3 questions in this part of lecture 2. So here are your 3 questions. First, what is the name of the religious group that wants to expel the Catholicism from the Church of England? So this group of religious dissenters in England wish to expel Catholicism from the Church of England, to clean up the Church of England. All right. Question number 2. This colony was founded by religious dissenters exiled from Massachusetts. This colony was founded by religious dissenters who were exiled from Massachusetts. And finally, question number 3, what is the name of the religious group who founded Pennsylvania and who brought the concept of religious tolerance to North America? What is the name of the religious group that founded Pennsylvania and brought the concept of religious tolerance to North America? So those are your 3 questions. Remember, you're collecting all these questions together in a single document that you will turn in along with your essay at test time. And also remember, you can always reach out to me with questions, comments, concerns. You just want to talk about the material, you have something to share with me. I'm always happy to hear from you. Email me at any time, and I will respond to you as promptly as I can after I see that email. So I hope everybody is doing well, and that we're getting into the swing of things now, and I will look forward to being with you on our next video session.